I was shivering under a bus stop awning on Christmas Eve when a man with my dead father's tattoo pulled up in a black SUV and said the 5 words that would change everything. "Get in the car, Natalie." He knew my name. He had the phoenix rising from flames inked on his left forearm, identical down to the smallest feather, the exact same design my father had gotten 20 years ago. The same tattoo I'd watched the funeral home cover with makeup before they closed his casket 5 years earlier. This stranger shouldn't exist, yet here he was, offering me shelter on the coldest night of my life. I was 30 years old, college educated, and I'd been sleeping in doorways for 3 weeks. But what happened after I got in that car, what this man revealed about my father, about the money that should have been mine, and about the people I'd trusted most, it didn't just give me back my life. It exposed a conspiracy that had been unfolding since the day my father died, and it proved that sometimes the family who finds you matters more than the family who abandons you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how a stranger with an impossible tattoo helped me reclaim everything that was stolen, and how the mother who threw me out turned out to be hiding secrets that would destroy her completely. Stay with me, because what started as a freezing night under that bus stop became a battle that would put my own mother in handcuffs and prove that my father's love had been protecting me even after death. My name is Natalie Brooks, and I need to take you back 5 years to understand how I ended up homeless on Christmas Eve. Back to the day my father died and the moment my mother looked at me across his hospital bed with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't grief. It was calculation. My father, Thomas Brooks, was a successful architect in Portland, Oregon. He'd built a firm from nothing, starting with small residential projects in the early 90s and eventually landing contracts for major commercial buildings throughout the Pacific Northwest. Brooks and Foster Architecture occupied a beautiful renovated warehouse in the Pearl District, all exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the gray Portland light my father loved. He used to say that shadows made better buildings than sunshine ever could, that you had to understand darkness to appreciate where light belonged. Growing up, I was his shadow. While other kids spent weekends at soccer practice or dance recitals, I spent mine in his office, watching him sketch elevations and explain load-bearing walls. He'd let me sit at his drafting table with my own pencils, creating elaborate floor plans for imaginary houses. He never dismissed my childish drawings or told me I was in the way. Instead, he'd study my work seriously, asking questions about why I'd placed windows where I did, whether I'd considered how people would move through the space, treating my amateur designs with the same respect he gave his million-dollar projects. My mother, Claire, tolerated this relationship between us with the patience of someone waiting for a phase to pass. She'd married my father when she was 24 and he was 32, drawn to his quiet intensity and his growing success. She came from a family that valued appearances and social standing, and my father's architectural firm provided both. She threw dinner parties for his clients, decorated our home in West Lynn with expensive furniture, and made sure everyone knew she was married to Thomas Brooks, the man designing half of Portland's skyline. But she never understood him, not really. She didn't understand why he'd spend hours talking to construction workers about proper foundation work, or why he'd drive across the city to see how afternoon light hit a building he'd designed 3 years earlier. She saw his work as a means to an end, a way to fund the lifestyle she wanted. He saw it as a conversation with space and time, a way to create shelter that would outlive him. I was their only child, and from an early age, I understood that I belonged more to my father's world than my mother's. She wanted me in dresses at her garden club luncheons. He wanted me in work boots at construction sites. She enrolled me in piano lessons. He taught me how to read blueprints. She tried to shape me into a smaller version of herself. He encouraged me to become whoever I wanted to be. The tension between them grew as I got older, though they hid it well behind closed doors and pleasant public faces. My mother's frustration with my father's long hours and modest lifestyle despite his substantial income created a constant low-level hum of dissatisfaction in our house. She wanted the vacation home in Bend, the new luxury SUV every 2 years, the country club membership. He wanted to reinvest in his firm, pay his employees well, and save for my college education. When I was 23 and finishing my architecture degree at University of Oregon, following so clearly in my father's footsteps that everyone called me Thomas Brooks' daughter before they called me Natalie. My mother met Gregory Palmer at a charity gala. Gregory was everything my father wasn't. Loud where my father was quiet, flashy where my father was modest, concerned with status where my father cared about craft. He owned a luxury car dealership and wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. My father noticed the change in my mother immediately. The way she started spending more time at charity events, the way she'd check her phone constantly and smile at messages she wouldn't share. He never confronted her directly, at least not that I witnessed, but I saw the sadness settle into his eyes, the way he'd look at her across the dinner table as if mourning someone who was still sitting right there. 2 years later, when I was 25 and working as a junior architect at a small firm downtown, my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4, the doctor said, using that clinical tone that's supposed to soften devastating news but only makes it feel more final. 6 months to a year if they were lucky, possibly less. My mother's reaction told me everything I needed to know about the state of their marriage. She cried, yes, but there was something performative about it, something that felt rehearsed. She made the right sounds and said the appropriate things, but her eyes stayed dry even as her voice trembled. My father noticed too. I saw it in the way he stopped reaching for her hand, the way he turned his face toward the window instead of toward her when the doctor explained treatment options. I moved back home to help care for him. My mother hired a nurse, but I wanted to be there, wanted to spend whatever time remained learning everything he still had to teach me. Those months were brutal and beautiful in equal measure. Brutal because watching him weaken was like watching a building collapse in slow motion, every day another support beam giving way. Beautiful because we talked in ways we'd never talked before, about his childhood, about his dreams for me, about his regrets and hopes. He talked a lot about his business partner, Diane Foster. They'd started the firm together 23 years earlier, two ambitious architects with more talent than capital. She'd been his best friend, he said, someone who understood the work the way he did. They'd built something meaningful together, something that would last beyond both of them. He also talked about Vincent Harper, his best friend from college, the one who'd been there when he'd gotten his phoenix tattoo at a shop near campus. They'd both gotten matching ones, my father explained, a symbol of transformation and rebirth after they'd both survived difficult childhoods. Vincent had moved to Seattle years ago for work, and they'd lost touch gradually the way people do when life gets busy. My father regretted that distance, wished he'd been better about maintaining the friendship. In his final weeks, my father made arrangements with methodical precision. He updated his will with his attorney. He wrote letters to important people in his life. He organized all his files and passwords, creating detailed instructions for how to handle his estate. He met with Diane to discuss the transition of his share of the firm, making sure the business would continue smoothly after he was gone. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that my mother was making her own plans during those final weeks. Plans that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with greed. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March, with me holding his left hand and my mother holding his right. The hospital room was quiet except for the machines monitoring his fading vitals. I watched his chest rise and fall with increasing difficulty, each breath requiring more effort than the last. In his final moments, he squeezed my hand 3 times, our old signal from when I was little. I love you. I squeezed back 3 times. I love you too. Then he was gone, and the machines made that terrible flat sound that means everything has ended, and my mother pulled her hand away from his as if she'd been released from an obligation. The funeral was exactly what my mother wanted and nothing like what my father would have chosen. Expensive flowers, a catered reception, a minister who'd never met him reading generic prayers. She wore black Chanel and accepted condolences with practiced grace, playing the role of bereaved widow with the skill of someone who'd been rehearsing. I stood beside his casket in the simple black dress I'd bought the day before, looking at his face made strange by the funeral home's cosmetics, and focused on his left forearm where the phoenix tattoo should have been visible. They'd covered it with makeup, making his skin smooth and unmarked. I hated that. The tattoo had been important to him, a reminder that he'd risen from difficult beginnings to create something meaningful. Hiding it felt like erasing part of who he was. 2 weeks after the funeral, my mother sat me down in the living room of our West Lynn house and told me about Gregory Palmer. She was in love with him, she said. They'd been seeing each other for over a year. She wanted to start her life over, wanted to be happy again after years of feeling unfulfilled. She was selling the house and moving into Gregory's place in Lake Oswego. I asked her about my father, about their marriage, about whether she'd cared about him at all toward the end. She looked at me with something like pity and said that I was too young to understand how complicated adult relationships could be, that love wasn't always enough, that sometimes people grew apart. Then she told me I needed to find my own place within the month. The house was being listed, she needed the equity for her new life, and at 25 I was old enough to be independent. She said it kindly, almost apologetically, but firmly. It was time for both of us to move forward. I moved into a small studio apartment in southeast Portland, paying rent with my modest salary from the architecture firm where I worked. The apartment was nothing special, just a converted attic space with sloped ceilings and a kitchenette barely big enough for a hot plate, but it was mine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I threw myself into work, trying to process my grief through design, staying late at the office and volunteering for every project anyone would give me. My mother married Gregory Palmer 4 months after my father died. I wasn't invited to the ceremony. She called to tell me about it afterward, her voice bright with happiness, describing the intimate gathering at a vineyard in Willamette Valley. Just close friends and family, she said, which apparently didn't include me. 6 months after my father's death, Diane Foster called me into her office at Brooks & Foster Architecture. I thought maybe she was going to offer me a position at the firm my father had built, a way to carry on his legacy. Instead, she told me there had been complications with my father's estate, that some of his assets were tied up in legal disputes, and that she couldn't afford to keep me on staff while those issues were being resolved. She let me go with 2 weeks severance and an expression that looked genuinely sorry. I found work at another small firm, but the pay was even less than before. I struggled to make rent, picking up freelance drafting work on weekends, eating cheap ramen and learning to stretch a grocery budget further than I'd thought possible. My mother didn't call to check on me. When I called her, she answered with distracted pleasantness, mentioning how busy she was with her new life, how Gregory kept her social calendar so full. A year after my father died, everything fell apart at once. The firm where I worked lost its major client and had to make cuts. I was the newest hire, so I was the first to go. I applied everywhere, but Portland's architecture market was saturated with talented designers, and my thin resume couldn't compete. I burned through my tiny savings in 6 weeks, then I maxed out the one credit card I had trying to cover rent and basic expenses. When I couldn't make rent for the 3rd consecutive month, my landlord evicted me. I packed what I could carry into 2 duffel bags and left everything else behind: furniture I'd bought at Goodwill, books I'd collected since childhood, the drafting table my father had given me for my 16th birthday. I called my mother from the sidewalk outside my apartment building, explained that I'd been evicted, asked if I could stay with her and Gregory just until I got back on my feet. She said no. She said it kindly, but she said it firmly. She and Gregory had a certain lifestyle, she explained, and having a house guest would disrupt their routine. Besides, I was 26 years old, capable and educated. This was probably the push I needed to really figure out my life, to get serious about my career, to stop depending on other people. She suggested I look into shelter resources, said she'd read about programs for young adults in transition. Then she hung up because she and Gregory had dinner reservations. I spent that night in my car, a 12-year-old Honda Civic my father had helped me buy when I'd graduated college. I parked in a grocery store lot and tried to sleep across the back seat, but it was too short and too cold, and every sound made me jump awake convinced someone was trying to break in. The next morning I drove to a public library and used their computers to search for jobs, for cheap rooms for rent, for any option that didn't involve sleeping in my car. I applied to dozens of positions, everything from architecture firms to retail stores to restaurants. No one called back. 3 days later, my car was towed from the grocery store parking lot for overnight parking violations. I didn't have the $400 to get it out of impound. Everything I owned was locked inside it. That's when I became truly homeless, not just temporarily displaced but actually living on the streets. I carried what I could in a backpack I'd grabbed before the tow truck drove away. Changes of clothes, my father's watch that I'd inherited, a folder of my design work, my phone and its charger, a water bottle. Everything else was gone. Portland in December is cold and wet, the kind of damp cold that seeps into your bones and never quite leaves. I learned quickly which doorways offered the most shelter, which coffee shops would let you sit for hours if you bought one small drip coffee, which public restrooms were safest for washing up. I learned to recognize the other homeless people, the ones who'd been out here for years, and I listened to their advice about where to find free meals and which shelters had open beds. Cedar Haven Community Shelter became my regular stop for dinner, a warm meal served by volunteers who treated everyone with dignity regardless of how they'd ended up there. A woman named Monica Reeves worked there most evenings, a former social worker who'd left her agency job to do direct service work. She remembered names, asked how people were doing, treated the shelter clients like human beings instead of problems to be managed. Monica noticed me the first night I showed up, probably because I was younger than most of the other guests and still had that look of someone freshly shocked by their circumstances. She brought me extra portions of food and sat with me while I ate, not asking questions, just offering quiet company. Over the following weeks, she checked on me regularly, making sure I knew about job resources and housing programs, offering encouragement when everything felt impossible. I tried to maintain some sense of normalcy, some connection to who I'd been before. I kept my phone charged using outlets at the library, though I rarely had anyone to call. I washed my clothes at laundromats when I could scrape together enough quarters. I spent hours working on design sketches, trying to keep my skills sharp for when I finally landed an interview, even though interviews never came. The hardest part wasn't the cold or the hunger or even the fear. The hardest part was the invisibility, the way people looked through me like I was a ghost, the way I'd become someone they crossed the street to avoid. I'd gone from being Thomas Brooks' daughter, promising young architect, to being that homeless girl sleeping under the Morrison Bridge, someone whose story people didn't want to know. I thought about my mother often during those weeks, wondered if she ever thought about me, if it bothered her at all that her daughter was sleeping in doorways while she lived in comfort with Gregory. I thought about calling her again, begging her for help, but pride and hurt kept me from dialing. She'd made her choice clear when she'd told me to look into shelter resources. By Christmas Eve, I'd been on the streets for 3 weeks. I'd learned to survive, but I hadn't learned to hope. I'd stopped believing that anything would change, that I'd ever be anything other than this, a failure my father would have been ashamed of, a cautionary tale about what happens when you can't make it on your own. I was huddled under a bus stop awning near Pioneer Courthouse Square, watching Christmas shoppers hurry past with bags full of gifts, watching families bundled together against the cold, watching everyone who had somewhere warm to go. The Christmas lights strung across the square looked beautiful but felt cruel, all that brightness highlighting how dark my own situation had become. That's when the black SUV pulled up to the curb, its windows tinted dark, its engine running smooth and expensive. The passenger window rolled down, and I saw him for the first time. A man in his mid-50s with silver threading through his dark hair, wearing a wool coat that looked professionally tailored, with kind eyes and a familiar smile I couldn't quite place. Then he lifted his left hand to gesture toward me, and I saw the tattoo on his forearm. The phoenix rising from flames, wings spread wide, every detail identical to the one my father had worn. The same design, the same placement, the same size. Impossible, except it was right there in front of me. He leaned toward the open window and said my name with absolute certainty, as if he'd been looking for me specifically. "Natalie," he said, and his voice carried something I hadn't heard directed at me in so long it took me a moment to recognize it. Concern, genuine and unperformed. Then he said the 5 words that would change everything. "Get in the car, Natalie." I stared at him through the cold December rain, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. The tattoo was impossible. My father had been dead for 5 years, cremated, his ashes scattered in the Columbia River Gorge at his favorite hiking spot. That phoenix tattoo had been reduced to ash along with the rest of him. Yet here was an identical copy on a stranger's arm, perfect down to the smallest detail. Every instinct I developed over 3 weeks on the streets screamed at me not to get into a stranger's vehicle. I'd watched enough true crime documentaries to know that vulnerable women disappeared every day, that predators specifically targeted people like me, people with nowhere to go and no one looking for them. I'd seen other homeless women vanish from their usual spots, heard whispered stories about what might have happened to them, learned to trust my fear because fear kept you alive. But something about this man felt different. Maybe it was the way he said my name, not with the pitying tone strangers used when they dropped coins in my cup, but with recognition, as if he actually knew me. Maybe it was the tattoo, that impossible phoenix that shouldn't exist. Maybe it was simply that I was so cold and tired and desperate that even potential danger seemed better than another night shivering under a bus stop. I stood up slowly, my joints stiff from hours of sitting on frozen concrete, and took 2 hesitant steps toward the SUV. The interior looked warm, the leather seats a deep tan color, the dashboard glowing with soft blue lights. I could see a coffee cup in the center console, steam still rising from it. The ordinary details of someone's normal life, so far removed from my current existence that they seemed like props from a movie set. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice rough from disuse. I hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 days except to say thank you to the shelter volunteers who'd served me dinner. The man's expression softened with something that looked like sadness mixed with understanding. "My name is Vincent Harper," he said. "I was your father's best friend in college. We got these tattoos together 23 years ago at a shop near campus, back when we were young and thought marking our skin with symbols of transformation meant we'd actually transformed into something better than what we'd come from." He rolled up his sleeve further, showing me the full design. I knew my father's version by heart, had traced it with my fingers when I was little, asking him to tell me again about the phoenix that died in flames and was reborn from its own ashes. This tattoo matched it exactly, every feather, every flame, every detail preserved across decades and distance. "Your father talked about you constantly," Vincent continued, his voice gentle but clear despite the traffic noise around us. "Every time we spoke, which wasn't often enough toward the end, he'd tell me what you were working on, how proud he was of you, how you'd inherited not just his talent but his way of seeing buildings as living things. When he got sick, he called me. Asked me to promise something." The cold rain soaked through my jacket, but I barely noticed. "What did he ask you to promise?" Vincent's eyes held mine with an intensity that felt important, as if what he said next would reshape everything I thought I understood about my father's death and the months that followed. "He asked me to watch over you if anything ever happened to him. He said he was worried about your mother, about decisions she might make, about whether you'd be protected. He made me promise that if you ever needed help, I'd be there. I lost track of you for a while after he died. Your mother changed numbers, moved, and you seemed to disappear. I'd been looking for you for 2 months, checking shelters, asking around, showing your photo to outreach workers. Monica at Cedar Haven called me 3 days ago and said you'd been coming in for meals." "Monica knew about this," I said, trying to understand the shape of something I couldn't quite see yet. "She called you?" "She's on the board of a foundation I run for homeless youth," Vincent explained. "She recognized your last name, remembered your father from the obituary. She thought I should know you were in trouble." The fact that Monica had been quietly working behind the scenes to help me, that she'd connected me to someone from my father's past without saying a word, made my throat tighten with emotion I couldn't afford to feel standing on a street corner. I'd thought I was completely alone, invisible to everyone who'd once known me. But Monica had seen me, really seen me, and she'd reached out on my behalf to someone who might actually care. "Why would my father think I'd need protection from my own mother?" I asked, even though part of me already knew the answer, had known it since the day she'd refused to let me stay with her and Gregory. Vincent's jaw tightened. "Get in the car, Natalie. It's Christmas Eve, you're freezing, and what I need to tell you about your mother and what she did after your father died, you shouldn't hear standing in the rain. Please. Let me buy you dinner somewhere warm, let me explain everything your father wanted you to know." I looked back at the bus stop where I'd been sitting, at the thin blanket I'd left there, at the backpack containing everything I still owned in the world. 3 weeks ago I'd had an apartment and a job and a life that resembled normal. Now a stranger with my dead father's tattoo was offering me warmth and answers, and I had to decide whether to trust him or walk away back into the cold. The decision should have been harder than it was. But the truth is that when you've been homeless for weeks, when you've been hungry and cold and invisible for so long that you've started to forget what it felt like to be seen as fully human, someone offering you basic kindness can override every safety protocol you've ever learned. I was so tired of being cold, so tired of being alone, so tired of surviving without actually living. I walked to the passenger side of the SUV and opened the door. The blast of warm air that hit me when I climbed inside almost made me cry. Vincent waited until I'd buckled my seatbelt before pulling away from the curb, merging smoothly into the Christmas Eve traffic heading through downtown Portland. We drove in silence for several minutes while I held my hands up to the heating vents, feeling slowly returning to my numb fingers. The world outside the windows looked different from inside a warm car, softer somehow, less hostile. The Christmas lights I'd found cruel from the bus stop looked almost beautiful again, reflecting off the wet pavement in streaks of red and green and gold. Vincent drove us to a small Italian restaurant in northwest Portland, the kind of neighborhood place with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles, family photos covering the walls. The owner greeted Vincent by name, clearly a regular, and led us to a quiet corner booth without commenting on my appearance. I was acutely aware of how I must look, my hair unwashed for days, my clothes wrinkled and stained, smelling of the streets and desperation. But Vincent acted as if there was nothing unusual about our dinner, as if he regularly brought homeless women to nice restaurants on Christmas Eve. "Order whatever you want," he said, handing me a menu. "As much as you want. You need a real meal." I ordered pasta and soup and bread, more food than I could possibly eat but unable to resist the opportunity after weeks of rationing every calorie. When the bread basket arrived, warm and fragrant, I had to stop myself from shoving entire pieces in my mouth, forcing myself to eat slowly despite my body's screaming hunger. Vincent waited until I'd eaten half my soup before he started talking. His voice was measured, careful, as if he'd rehearsed what he needed to say but wasn't sure how I'd react to hearing it. "Your father updated his will 6 weeks before he died," Vincent began. "He was very specific about his wishes. Half his estate was to go to Diane Foster, his business partner, to purchase his share of the firm and ensure the business continued. The other half was to go to you. All of it. The house in West Lynn, his retirement accounts, his life insurance, everything that wasn't tied up in the business. He estimated it at roughly $1.4 million. I set down my spoon, no longer able to focus on eating. My mother told me there were complications with the estate, that assets were tied up in legal disputes. She never mentioned any inheritance coming to me." Vincent's expression darkened. "That's because your mother contested the will. She claimed that your father wasn't of sound mind when he updated it, that the cancer and pain medications had impaired his judgment, that his original will from years earlier, which left everything to her as his spouse, should be honored instead. She hired an expensive lawyer and filed challenges that tied up the estate in probate court. But he was completely lucid when he updated his will," I protested. "I was there with him most days during those final weeks. He knew exactly what he was doing, he was planning everything carefully." "I know," Vincent said. "Your father anticipated that your mother might challenge his wishes. That's why he asked me to be there when he met with his attorney, to serve as a witness to his mental capacity, to document that he was making these decisions freely and with full understanding. He also recorded a video explaining his reasoning, just like he documented everything else in his life. He wanted to make absolutely certain you'd be protected." "Then why didn't the will stand up in court?" I asked, my voice rising with frustration and confusion. "Why am I homeless while my mother lives in a mansion in Lake Oswego if my father left everything to me?" Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder, setting it on the table between us. "Because your mother did something unforgivable. She committed fraud. And she didn't do it alone. Gregory Palmer helped her, and so did the attorney they hired. Together they manufactured evidence, falsified documents, and bribed a court official to make sure the case never reached a fair hearing." He opened the folder and showed me papers I didn't fully understand, legal documents with official seals, financial records, email printouts. But even without grasping all the details, I could see the shape of what he was showing me. A conspiracy to steal my inheritance, to ensure that my mother got everything my father had wanted me to have. "I hired a private investigator 6 months ago," Vincent continued, after I finally tracked down Diane Foster and she told me what had happened with the will, how you'd lost your job when legal complications affected the firm's finances, how your mother had somehow won the probate case despite your father's clear wishes. The investigator is good, thorough, and what he found is enough to put your mother in prison. The restaurant suddenly felt too warm, too close. I couldn't breathe properly. My mother hadn't just refused to help me when I was desperate. She'd actively stolen from me, had conspired to take what my father had meant for me to have, had watched me lose everything while she lived comfortably on money that should have been mine. Why didn't you come to me sooner? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did you let me end up on the streets if you knew what she'd done? Vincent's face filled with genuine regret. I didn't know you were homeless until Monica called me 3 days ago. I'd been trying to find you for months, but you'd disappeared. Your phone number was disconnected, your last known address was an eviction notice, and none of your father's old colleagues knew where you'd gone. When Monica told me she'd been serving you dinner at Cedar Haven, that you'd been sleeping rough for weeks, I drove straight there. But you weren't there that night or the next. I've been searching for you every day since, checking every shelter, every known camp, every place the outreach workers suggested. I finally spotted you tonight, and I wasn't about to let you disappear again. The pasta arrived but I couldn't eat anymore, my stomach twisted with anger and shock and a grief I'd thought I'd already processed. I'd mourned my father 5 years ago, had made my peace with his death as much as anyone ever makes peace with losing the parent who truly loved them. But now I was mourning him again in a different way, grieving for the protection he'd tried to give me, for the inheritance he'd carefully arranged, for the future he'd wanted me to have that my mother had stolen. What happens now? I asked. If you have proof of fraud, if you have enough evidence to put her in prison, what are you going to do with it? Vincent closed the folder and met my eyes with an expression of absolute certainty. We're going to get your inheritance back. We're going to expose what your mother and Gregory did. We're going to make sure they face consequences for what they've stolen. But I can't do any of it without you, Natalie. You're the victim here, you're the rightful heir, and you need to be the one to stand up in court and demand justice. I'm homeless, I said, gesturing at my stained clothes, at the evidence of my current state. I don't have money for a lawyer, I don't have anywhere to live, I don't even have a car anymore. How am I supposed to fight someone like my mother who has resources and attorneys and apparently no conscience at all? Vincent reached across the table and did something my mother hadn't done in 5 years. He took my hand, held it gently, and spoke to me like I mattered. You're going to stay with me and my wife in Lake Oswego. You're going to sleep in a warm bed and eat regular meals and remember what it feels like to be safe. I'm going to introduce you to the best probate attorney in Oregon, someone who specializes in will contests and inheritance fraud, and I'm going to pay for everything because that's what I promised your father I'd do if you ever needed help. And then we're going to walk into court and prove that you're Thomas Brooks' daughter, that you deserve everything he wanted you to have, and that your mother is a thief who deserves to lose everything she stole. The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that justice was possible, that I wasn't powerless despite having nothing, it broke something open inside me that had been locked tight since the night I'd slept in my car for the first time. I started crying there in the restaurant booth, tears streaming down my face while Vincent sat quietly holding my hand, not trying to stop my crying or make me feel embarrassed about falling apart in public. When I finally had control of my voice again, I asked the question that had been building since he'd first pulled up to that bus stop. Why would you do all this for me? You lost touch with my father years ago, you don't really know me, you don't owe me anything. Why would you spend your own money fighting my mother when you could just walk away? Vincent smiled, and I saw something in his expression that reminded me of my father, that same quality of quiet intensity, of caring deeply about doing the right thing even when it cost you something. Your father saved my life when we were in college, he said. I was in a bad place, struggling with things I didn't know how to handle, and he pulled me out of it. He didn't have to, we'd only known each other a few months, but he showed up for me anyway. He told me once that the only thing that matters in life is whether you show up for people who need you, whether you see someone struggling and decide to help or decide to look away. He never looked away from anyone who needed him. Vincent's grip on my hand tightened slightly. When he called me those months before he died, when he asked me to promise I'd watch over you if anything happened, He wasn't asking me to take care of you like you were helpless. He was asking me to make sure you got the chance to become everything you're capable of becoming, to make sure the people who should have protected you didn't destroy you instead. I'm doing this because your father would have done it for my daughter if our situations were reversed. I'm doing it because you deserve justice. And I'm doing it because I can, and that means I should. We finished dinner in a different kind of silence than the one that had filled the car ride, this one comfortable and almost peaceful. Vincent insisted I order dessert, tiramisu that tasted better than anything I'd eaten in months, and he told me stories about my father in college that made me laugh for the first time in weeks. Stories about late-night drafting sessions and terrible punk concerts and the absolute certainty they both felt that they were going to change the world through architecture. When we left the restaurant, the rain had stopped and the night had that scrubbed clean quality that Portland winter air gets after a storm passes through. Vincent drove us to his home in Lake Oswego, a beautiful contemporary house overlooking the lake, all clean lines and walls of windows that must have been stunning in daylight. His wife Hannah met us at the door, a warm woman in her early 50s who hugged me like I was someone she'd been waiting to meet, not a stranger her husband had picked up off the street. She showed me to a guest room that was larger than my old studio apartment had been, with an attached bathroom and a closet full of spare clothes she thought might fit me. There were fresh towels laid out on the bed, toiletries arranged on the bathroom counter, everything I might need to feel human again. Take a long hot shower, Hannah said gently. Take as long as you need. There's a robe hanging on the door and your clothes will be in the dryer when you're done. We'll talk more in the morning, but tonight just rest. You're safe here, Natalie. You don't have to be on guard anymore. I stood in that shower for 45 minutes, letting hot water wash away weeks of dirt and fear, watching the grime circle the drain, crying again because I'd forgotten what it felt like to be warm all the way through. When I finally turned off the water and wrapped myself in the soft robe, I looked at myself in the mirror for the first time in days. I looked terrible, my face gaunt, my eyes hollowed out by exhaustion, my hair a tangled mess. But I also looked like someone who might survive this, who might make it through to whatever came next. I slept that night in a bed with clean sheets and a down comforter, in a room with a door that locked from the inside, in a house where people had invited me to stay because they wanted to help rather than because they pitied me. I slept for 12 hours straight, the kind of deep dreamless sleep that comes when your body finally feels safe enough to fully rest. When I woke on Christmas morning, I found Vincent and Hannah in their kitchen drinking coffee and making breakfast. They included me in their quiet holiday routines as if it was completely normal to have a homeless stranger spending Christmas with them, as if there was nothing unusual about opening their home to someone they barely knew. After breakfast, Vincent took me into his home office and showed me everything his private investigator had compiled. Bank records proving that my mother had received the full estate settlement despite my father's will clearly leaving half to me. Email correspondence between her attorney and a court clerk that suggested money had changed hands to expedite her case. Financial records showing that Gregory Palmer had paid the attorney substantial fees. Documents proving that my mother had knowingly provided false testimony about my father's mental state, claiming he'd been confused and incoherent when I'd been there and witnessed his absolute clarity. The investigator had been thorough, and what he'd found was damning. My mother hadn't just contested the will through legal means. She'd orchestrated fraud at multiple levels, bribing officials, falsifying evidence, and perjuring herself in court documents. The proof was comprehensive and irrefutable. We have enough to file criminal charges, Vincent said. But we're going to start with civil court, filing a motion to overturn the original probate decision and restore your father's intended will. Once we establish in civil court that fraud occurred, the criminal charges will follow naturally. Your mother will face prison time, Gregory Palmer will face charges as an accessory, and their attorney will be disbarred at minimum. The scope of what Vincent was proposing, the complete destruction of my mother's comfortable life, should have made me hesitate. Part of me still remembered being a little girl who'd loved her mother despite her coldness, who'd wanted her approval even when it never came. But then I thought about standing in the rain on Christmas Eve with nowhere to go, thought about the night I'd been evicted and called her begging for help, thought about how easily she'd said no. She'd made her choice when she'd committed fraud to steal my inheritance. She'd made her choice when she'd refused me shelter while living in a house bought with money my father had meant for me. She'd made her choice every time she'd prioritized her own comfort over my survival. When do we start? I asked. Vincent smiled. Tomorrow morning, we meet with Adrian Cole, the attorney I mentioned. He's expecting us at 9. He's reviewed the basic facts of the case and he's convinced we can win. After that, we start building the formal case, deposing witnesses, compiling evidence for court. It's going to take months, Natalie. This kind of litigation moves slowly. But you'll stay here with us for as long as it takes, and we'll see it through together. That night, my second night in Vincent and Hannah's home, I lay in the guest bed and thought about my father. About the promises he'd extracted from his best friend, about the protections he'd tried to put in place, about how his love had reached across 5 years to save me through someone who'd gotten the same tattoo decades ago in a college town shop. The phoenix had died and been reborn. Maybe I could too. Adrian Cole's law office occupied the top floor of a renovated building in downtown Portland, all exposed brick and polished concrete floors that managed to feel both historic and modern simultaneously. Vincent and I arrived 15 minutes early on the day after Christmas, both of us dressed professionally. Hannah had taken me shopping the previous afternoon, insisting I needed proper clothes for meetings with attorneys, and I'd felt strange trying on business casual outfits after weeks of wearing the same 3 shirts in rotation. The receptionist led us into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. I stood looking at the water while we waited, watching the bridges span the distance between East and West Portland, thinking about gaps and connections, about how my father had spent his career designing structures that brought separated things together. Adrian Cole entered the room with the kind of presence that suggested he'd won more cases than he'd lost. He was in his late 40s, black, with silver touching his temples and eyes that assessed you quickly but not unkindly. He shook Vincent's hand first, then mine, holding my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that felt genuine rather than performative. "I've reviewed the materials Vincent sent over, and I want you to know up front that what was done to you constitutes one of the clearest cases of probate fraud I've encountered in 23 years of practice. Your mother didn't just bend rules or exploit loopholes. She committed multiple felonies to steal your inheritance." We sat down around the conference table and Adrian opened a thick file, pulling out documents and organizing them into neat stacks. He walked me through everything systematically, explaining each piece of evidence in language I could understand, never talking down to me but also never assuming I had legal knowledge I didn't possess. "The timeline is straightforward," he began. "Your father updated his will 6 weeks before his death, leaving half his estate to Diane Foster for the business and half to you personally. He did this in the presence of his attorney and Vincent as witness. He was videotaped explaining his reasoning, and his mental capacity was documented by his oncologist who confirmed he was lucid and fully competent to make legal decisions." Adrian slid the first document toward me, a copy of my father's will with his signature clear at the bottom. 2 weeks after his death, your mother filed to have this will overturned, claiming your father had been mentally impaired when he signed it. She provided false testimony stating that he'd been confused, that he hadn't recognized family members, that he'd been heavily medicated and not in control of his faculties. The next document showed my mother's sworn statement, her signature attesting to lies I knew were absolutely false. I'd been with my father during those final weeks. He'd been tired and in pain, yes, but his mind had been sharp until the very end. He'd been planning, organizing, making sure everything was handled properly. My mother had barely been present during that time, appearing for an hour or 2 in the evenings, leaving most of the actual care to me and the hospice nurse. Her attorney, a man named Richard Sutton, submitted supporting documentation that appeared to show your father's cognitive decline, Adrian continued. Medical records suggesting confusion and disorientation. The problem is that these records were falsified. We've obtained the actual medical records directly from your father's oncologist and hospice provider, and they tell a completely different story. Your father was alert and oriented until the day he died. How did her attorney get fake medical records? I asked. Wouldn't the hospital have protocols preventing that? Adrian's expression hardened. Sutton has a history of aggressive tactics in probate cases, several bar complaints over the years but nothing that resulted in serious sanctions. We believe he either fabricated the documents himself or paid someone with access to medical record templates to create them. Either way, it's criminal fraud, and it's going to cost him his license at minimum. He showed me the next set of documents, emails between my mother and Richard Sutton discussing strategy, how to present their case, what evidence they'd need to manufacture to make it convincing. The emails were damning in their casual discussion of illegal activity, as if committing fraud was just another tactical decision rather than something that could send them to prison. "Where did you get these emails?" I asked. "Wouldn't they be protected by attorney-client privilege?" Vincent answered this time. "My investigator, Kenneth Ramirez, is very good at digital forensics. Sutton's office has poor cybersecurity practices. Ken was able to access their email server legally through methods I won't detail here, but everything we obtained is admissible in court because it relates to ongoing criminal activity. Attorney-client privilege doesn't protect communications made in furtherance of a crime." Adrian continued walking me through the evidence. "Your mother's case was heard by a probate judge named Harrison Walsh. The hearing happened remarkably quickly, only 4 months after filing, which is unusual for contested estate cases. Judge Walsh ruled in your mother's favor, declaring your father's updated will invalid and restoring the previous will that left everything to your mother as surviving spouse. What we've discovered is that Judge Walsh received a payment of $75,000 2 weeks before the hearing, deposited into an offshore account we've traced back to Gregory Palmer. Walsh ruled in your mother's favor, the estate was settled in her favor, and she received approximately $1.4 million that should have come to you." I felt sick looking at the bank records showing the bribe, at the casual corruption that had stolen my future. A judge had been paid off, had violated every principle of justice he was supposed to uphold, and as a result I'd lost everything while my mother had grown wealthier. "Judge Walsh retired suddenly 6 months ago," Adrian said. "Moved to Costa Rica, very abrupt departure. We believe he knew an investigation might be coming and wanted to be outside U.S. jurisdiction. But that doesn't help your mother or Gregory Palmer or Richard Sutton. They're all still here, and they're all going to face consequences." Adrian pulled out a calendar and began mapping out our strategy. "We'll file a motion to vacate the original probate decision, arguing fraud on the court. We'll present all this evidence showing the falsified medical records, the bribed judge, the manufactured testimony. The beauty of this is that we don't just have suspicions or circumstantial evidence. We have proof. Financial records, emails, forensic analysis of the fake medical documents. It's comprehensive. Once we establish fraud in civil court and get the probate decision overturned, criminal charges will follow automatically. The district attorney will have no choice but to prosecute given the evidence. Your mother will face charges of fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. Gregory Palmer faces conspiracy and bribery charges. Richard Sutton faces fraud, forgery, and subordination of perjury. We're talking about significant prison time for all of them." The scope of what Adrian was describing felt overwhelming. My mother going to prison. Gregory Palmer facing criminal charges. An attorney being disbarred and prosecuted. All because they'd been greedy enough to steal from someone they thought was powerless to fight back. "How long will this take?" I asked. "How long before any of this actually happens?" Adrian looked at me with an honesty I appreciated. "Civil litigation moves slowly. Filing the motion will take 2 weeks to prepare properly. The court will take 30 to 60 days to schedule a hearing. The hearing itself could take several days depending on how much your mother's attorney fights back, though given the evidence I expect they'll fold quickly once they see what we have. After we win the civil case, the criminal investigation will take months. Indictments, arraignments, potentially trials unless they take plea deals. You're looking at 6 months minimum before any of them see the inside of a jail cell, possibly longer." He leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "In the meantime, you need stability. Vincent tells me you've been homeless for weeks, that you lost your job and your apartment. I'm going to recommend that we also file for emergency relief, asking the court to provide you with living expenses from the estate while the fraud case proceeds. You're entitled to that money, and there's no reason you should continue suffering while we sort out your mother's crimes." Vincent nodded his agreement. "And regardless of what the court decides about emergency relief, you're staying with Hannah and me for as long as this takes. We have the space, we have the resources, and your father would haunt me for eternity if I let you go back to sleeping on the streets while we fight this battle. The combination of practical legal strategy and genuine care from people who barely knew me created an emotional response I struggled to control. I'd spent weeks convinced I was completely alone, that no one cared whether I lived or died, that I'd fallen through every safety net society was supposed to provide. Now I was sitting in an attorney's office surrounded by people who were ready to fight for me, who believed I deserved justice, who were willing to dedicate time and resources to making things right. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Adrian said, his tone shifting to something more delicate. "Your mother doesn't know yet that we're coming after her. She thinks she got away with this, that the case is closed, that her fraud was successful. When we file our motion, when she gets served with papers accusing her of crimes that could send her to prison, she's going to panic. People who panic do unpredictable things." "What are you suggesting?" Vincent asked. Adrian looked at me carefully. "I'm suggesting that Natalie needs to be prepared for her mother to reach out, to try to make contact, possibly to offer some kind of deal or reconciliation. When people realize they're about to lose everything, they often try to manipulate their victims into showing mercy. Your mother might call, might show up at Vincent's house, might try to convince you that this is all a misunderstanding or that she's sorry." I thought about the last time I'd spoken to my mother, standing on the sidewalk outside my apartment building with everything I owned in 2 duffel bags, begging her to let me stay just until I got back on my feet. I remembered the kindness in her voice as she'd refused me, the gentle but firm way she'd suggested I look into shelter resources, the speed with which she'd ended the call because she had dinner reservations. "She can try to reach out," I said, my voice harder than I'd heard it sound in years. "But I won't answer. She made her choices. Now she gets to live with the consequences." Adrian smiled slightly. "Good. That's the right attitude. Don't engage with her at all. If she contacts you, document it but don't respond. Let me handle any communication that needs to happen. Your job right now is to focus on rebuilding your life, not on managing your mother's emotional manipulation." We spent another hour going over details, signing retainer agreements, discussing strategy and timeline. Adrian explained that he'd need depositions from several witnesses, including Diane Foster, my father's business partner, and the medical professionals who'd actually treated my father during his final weeks. He wanted Vincent's testimony about being present when the will was updated. He wanted me to provide a detailed account of my father's mental state during those final months. By the time we left Adrian's office, my head was spinning with information and legal terminology, but I also felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Actual tangible hope that justice might be possible, that the people who'd wronged me might face consequences, that my father's wishes might still be honored even 5 years after his death. Vincent took me to lunch at a small cafe near his office, a comfortable place where we could talk without the formality of his attorney's conference room. Over soup and sandwiches, he told me more about my father's college years, filling in pieces of history I'd never known. "Your father came from nothing," Vincent explained. "His parents were addicts who neglected him badly. He spent most of his teenage years bouncing between relatives who didn't really want him, working odd jobs to buy his own food and clothes, essentially raising himself. When he got to college on a combination of scholarships and student loans, he was determined to build something different, to create a life that looked nothing like the chaos he'd come from. That's why the Phoenix tattoo meant so much to him," I said, understanding clicking into place. He really was rising from ashes, creating himself new. Vincent nodded. "We both were, in different ways. We'd both survived childhoods that could have destroyed us, and we marked that survival on our skin so we'd never forget how far we'd come. Your father used to say that the worst thing that could happen to someone wasn't trauma itself, it was using trauma as an excuse to become cruel. He was determined to be kind despite everything he'd survived, to build rather than destroy, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "When he met your mother, I thought maybe he'd found someone who understood that vision. She was beautiful and poised and seemed to appreciate his ambition. But over the years I watched her change him in ways that worried me, watched her push him to care more about status and money than craft and integrity. I pulled back from the friendship because I didn't want to watch him lose himself to someone who didn't really see him." He looked at me directly, his eyes serious. That's my biggest regret. I should have stayed closer. I should have been there more during those years when your mother was slowly isolating him from everyone who actually cared about him. When he called me before he died, when he asked me to watch over you, I heard the urgency in his voice. He knew what your mother was capable of, knew she'd put her own interests ahead of yours, and he was trying to set up protections. I should have acted faster after he died. I should have checked on you sooner. You couldn't have known she'd commit fraud, I said. You couldn't have predicted she'd steal my inheritance and leave me homeless. That's not on you. Vincent shook his head. Maybe not. But I knew her character. I knew she was selfish and manipulative. I should have assumed she'd do something terrible and acted accordingly. Instead, I lost track of you for months while you suffered. That's something I'll have to live with. We finished lunch and Vincent drove me back to his house in Lake Oswego. Hannah was in the kitchen baking, the house filled with the warm smell of chocolate chip cookies. She handed me one fresh from the oven and asked how the meeting with Adrian had gone, listening carefully as I explained the strategy and timeline. Over the following weeks, I settled into a routine at Vincent and Hannah's house that felt increasingly normal despite the surreal circumstances that had brought me there. I had my own room, my own bathroom, access to their home office where I could work on rebuilding my portfolio. Hannah treated me like a houseguest she was genuinely happy to have, including me in meal planning and grocery shopping, asking my opinion on everything from what to watch on television to whether the living room needed repainting. Vincent introduced me to Diane Foster, my father's former business partner, over coffee at a shop near her office. Diane was in her late 50s with gray hair. She wore short and practical, architect's glasses, and hands marked with decades of drafting before computers replaced pencils. She greeted me with a hug that felt like recognition, like she'd been waiting years to see me again. You look so much like Thomas, she said, studying my face with an architect's attention to detail. Same eyes, same way of looking at spaces, like you're mentally redesigning them. He talked about you constantly. Every time you finished a project in school, every time you made Dean's List, every accomplishment, he'd tell me. He was so proud of you. We talked for 2 hours about my father, about the firm they'd built together, about the complications that had followed his death. Diane explained that my mother's fraud had affected the business badly, tying up assets that should have been resolved cleanly, creating legal complications that had cost the firm clients and revenue. I had to let you go because we couldn't afford your salary while the estate was in litigation, Diane said, her expression filled with regret. Your mother's attorney was blocking every attempt to settle Thomas's share of the business, demanding more money, creating delays. We lost 2 major contracts because clients didn't want to work with a firm embroiled in legal disputes. I hated firing you. You were talented and you were Thomas's daughter. But I didn't have a choice. I understood it better now, seeing how my mother's fraud had rippled outward, affecting not just me but everyone connected to my father's legacy. The firm he'd built had suffered. His business partner had struggled. His daughter had ended up homeless. All because one woman had decided she deserved money more than honesty. Diane agreed to provide testimony for Adrian's case, to explain how the probate fraud had affected the business, to speak to my father's mental clarity in his final weeks. She also offered me my job back once the legal situation was resolved, promising that there would be a place for me at Brooks & Foster Architecture when everything settled. Kenneth Ramirez, Vincent's private investigator, met with me several times to go over details of my mother's fraud, asking questions about my father's final weeks, about conversations I'd witnessed, about my mother's behavior during that time. Ken was in his early 40s, formerly with Portland Police Bureau's Fraud Division, now working private cases. He had the methodical demeanor of someone who'd spent years building cases evidence by evidence, never rushing, never making assumptions. Your mother got sloppy, Ken told me during one of our meetings. She was so confident that no one would challenge her, so certain that she'd gotten away with it, that she didn't cover her tracks carefully enough. The emails between her and Sutton should have been on encrypted channels, but they used regular office email. The payment to Judge Walsh should have been structured to hide the source, but Palmer just transferred money from his business account to an offshore bank in his own name. They committed sophisticated fraud but handled it like amateurs. He showed me photographs he'd taken of my mother and Gregory Palmer, surveillance images of them at expensive restaurants, at charity galas, at their Lake Oswego home. In every photo they looked comfortable and happy, confident in their wealth and status, completely unaware that their entire life was built on crimes that were about to be exposed. They think they're untouchable, Ken said. People like them always do. They believe that money and lawyers can solve any problem, that the rules don't apply to them. They're going to be shocked when they realize how wrong they are. 6 weeks after Christmas, 6 weeks after Vincent had found me shivering under a bus stop awning, Adrian filed our motion to vacate the probate decision. The filing was comprehensive, over 200 pages of evidence and legal argument, documenting every aspect of my mother's fraud. Adrian had his process server deliver the papers to my mother personally, wanted to make sure she understood exactly what was coming. The process server reported back that my mother had answered the door of the Lake Oswego house in yoga clothes, clearly just back from an exercise class. She'd accepted the papers with confusion rather than alarm, apparently not understanding what she was being served with until she started reading. Then, according to the server, her face had gone completely white and she'd asked him to leave immediately. Vincent's phone rang 6 hours later. I was in the kitchen with Hannah making dinner when he answered, listened for a moment, then put the call on speaker so we could all hear. Vincent, this is Claire Brooks, my mother's voice came through the phone, shaky but trying to sound controlled. I need to speak with you about a legal matter involving my daughter Natalie. I understand she's been staying with you. Vincent's expression remained neutral but his voice was cold. Claire. I wondered how long it would take you to call. There's been a terrible misunderstanding, my mother continued, her words coming faster now. Some attorney has filed paperwork claiming I committed fraud regarding Thomas's estate. It's completely false, obviously. Thomas left everything to me, the court confirmed that years ago. This whole thing is frivolous, probably someone trying to extort money from me. But I understand Natalie is involved somehow and I need to talk to her, need to explain what actually happened. Vincent looked at me, letting me decide whether to respond. I shook my head. I had nothing to say to her. Natalie doesn't want to speak with you, Vincent said flatly. And I'd suggest you direct all communication through your attorney from this point forward. The case against you is anything but frivolous, Claire. We have proof of everything. The falsified medical records, the bribed judge, the conspiracy with Gregory Palmer and Richard Sutton. You're going to lose in civil court, and then you're going to face criminal charges. The best thing you can do now is get yourself a good criminal defense attorney. There was silence on the other end of the line, then my mother's voice came back harder, more desperate. She's my daughter. I have a right to talk to her. Whatever you think I did, whatever lies someone has told you, I deserve a chance to explain my side before you poison her against me completely. You lost the right to talk to her when you committed fraud to steal her inheritance, Vincent said. You lost the right when she called you begging for help and you told her to look into shelter resources. You lost the right when you let your daughter sleep on the streets while you lived in comfort on money her father meant for her to have. Don't call here again, Claire. Let your attorney do your talking. He hung up before she could respond. The three of us stood in the kitchen in silence for a moment, the weight of that conversation settling over us. She sounded scared, Hannah said quietly. Good, I replied, surprised by how little sympathy I felt. She should be scared. She committed crimes. Now she gets to face consequences like anyone else would. That night I lay in bed thinking about my mother's voice, about the desperation I'd heard under her attempts at control. Part of me, the part that had been raised to respect and love her, felt something that might have been guilt or sadness. But mostly I felt angry. Angry that she'd called trying to manipulate Vincent instead of actually apologizing to me. Angry that she'd described what she'd done as a misunderstanding rather than fraud. Angry that even now, facing the exposure of her crimes, she was trying to position herself as the victim. She'd had 5 years to make things right. 5 years to admit what she'd done, to restore my inheritance, to act like someone who cared about her daughter more than money. She'd chosen wealth and comfort instead. Now she got to live with that choice. The court hearing was scheduled for late February, 8 weeks after Adrian filed our motion. Those 8 weeks passed in a strange mixture of normal routine and mounting tension. I spent my days rebuilding my architecture portfolio, reconnecting with former colleagues, and slowly remembering what it felt like to have a future worth planning for. Vincent and Hannah treated me less like a houseguest and more like family, including me in decisions about home renovations and asking my professional opinion on spatial design questions. But underneath the surface calm, I was preparing for war. Adrian had me review my deposition multiple times, practicing how to answer questions clearly and confidently, how to stay composed under cross-examination, how to present myself as credible and sympathetic without appearing rehearsed. We went over every detail of my father's final weeks, every conversation I'd witnessed, every moment that proved his mental clarity right up until his death. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about facing my mother across a courtroom, about speaking publicly about her fraud, about the moment when everything would either fall apart or come together. Vincent found me sitting in their living room at 2 a.m, staring out at the lake. He sat down beside me without speaking, just offering quiet company the way he had that first night when he'd bought me dinner and explained what my mother had done. After several minutes of comfortable silence, he finally spoke. "Your father used to say that buildings tell the truth about their architects," Vincent said. "You can't hide shoddy work behind fancy facades. Eventually the structure either holds or it collapses, and everyone can see what was actually built underneath the surface finishes. Your mother built her life on fraud and lies. Tomorrow we're just showing the court what was actually built underneath her expensive facade." "What if it doesn't work?" I asked. "What if the judge doesn't believe us? What if her attorney finds some loophole? What if she gets away with it again?" Vincent's expression was calm and certain. "Then we appeal. We keep fighting until someone listens." "But that's not going to happen, Natalie. Adrian doesn't lose cases like this. We have proof, not just allegations. We have bank records and emails and falsified documents and forensic analysis. Your mother's attorney knows he can't win. He's probably already advised her to settle, to admit wrongdoing and negotiate a resolution. She's the one who's going to insist on going to trial because she can't accept that she's been caught." He was right. Adrian had told us that my mother's attorney, a different lawyer than Richard Sutton who was now himself facing disbarment proceedings, had reached out multiple times trying to discuss settlement options. My mother had refused every overture, insisting her original probate victory was legitimate, that any evidence of fraud was fabricated, that this whole case was a conspiracy to steal from her. Her denial would have been almost admirable if it wasn't so transparently false. Even her own attorney seemed to understand she was guilty, but she'd apparently convinced herself that if she just maintained her innocence forcefully enough, reality would bend to accommodate her narrative. We arrived at the Multnomah County Courthouse at 8:30 the next morning. Adrian met us in the hallway outside the courtroom, carrying 2 large boxes of evidence and looking composed but focused. He'd brought his associate, a sharp young attorney named Lisa Park who specialized in forensic document analysis, to help present the technical aspects of our case. "Your mother and Gregory Palmer are already inside," Adrian told me. "Richard Sutton is not present, probably because he doesn't want to be seen publicly supporting a case built on fraud he helped commit. Judge Patricia Morrison is hearing the case. She's fair, thorough, and has a strong reputation for not tolerating misconduct by attorneys or parties. That works in our favor." We entered the courtroom and I saw my mother for the first time in over a year. She sat at the defendant's table with Gregory Palmer beside her, both of them dressed expensively, projecting an image of respectable wealthy citizens being unfairly attacked. My mother's hair was styled perfectly, her makeup applied with care, her jewelry subtle but clearly expensive. She looked nothing like someone who'd committed fraud and let her daughter become homeless. When she saw me walk in, her expression flickered through several emotions too quickly to parse. Shock, perhaps, at seeing me cleaned up and dressed professionally instead of in the stained clothes she probably imagined I was still wearing. Something that might have been guilt, though it passed so quickly I couldn't be certain. Then her face settled into cold anger, as if I'd betrayed her by daring to challenge her theft. Gregory Palmer whispered something to her and she turned away, refusing to look at me again. Good. I didn't want her attention or her acknowledgement. I wanted her to understand what it felt like to have someone who should care about you look through you as if you didn't exist. Judge Morrison entered and we all stood. She was a black woman in her early 60s with gray natural hair and eyes that suggested she'd presided over enough cases to spot dishonesty from across a courtroom. She took her seat, reviewed the file in front of her briefly, then looked up at both tables. "This is a motion to vacate a probate decision from 5 years ago on grounds of fraud on the court," she began, her voice clear and authoritative. "These are serious allegations. Mr. Cole, you're representing the movement Natalie Brooks. Mr. Harrison, you're representing the respondent Claire Palmer, formerly Brooks. Let's proceed with opening statements." Adrian stood and approached the podium. He didn't need notes. He'd been preparing this argument for months and every word was calibrated for maximum impact. "Your Honor, this case involves systematic fraud committed by Claire Palmer to steal her deceased husband's estate from his intended beneficiary, their daughter Natalie Brooks. Thomas Brooks updated his will 6 weeks before his death, leaving half his estate to his business partner and half to his daughter. He did this while fully mentally competent, in the presence of witnesses, with video documentation of his reasoning. After his death, Claire Palmer contested this will by submitting false testimony claiming her husband had been mentally impaired, by presenting falsified medical records suggesting cognitive decline that never occurred, and by bribing Judge Harrison Walsh to rule in her favor. We have proof of all of this. Adrian gestured to the boxes of evidence. Bank records showing the $75,000 payment from Gregory Palmer to Judge Walsh's offshore account. Emails between Claire Palmer and her attorney Richard Sutton discussing how to manufacture evidence and coordinate false testimony. Forensic analysis of the medical records submitted in the original probate case proving they were fabricated. Sworn statements from Thomas Brooks's actual medical providers confirming he was alert and competent until his death. Video testimony from Thomas Brooks himself explaining his wishes. This isn't a case of unclear evidence or competing interpretations. This is documented criminal fraud, and we're asking this court to vacate the fraudulent probate decision and restore Thomas Brooks's actual will. He sat down and my mother's attorney, a man named David Harrison who looked deeply uncomfortable with his client's position, stood to give his response. His opening statement was weak, almost apologetic, arguing that the original probate case had been decided properly, that any irregularities were minor administrative errors rather than fraud, that Claire Palmer had acted in good faith throughout. Even as he spoke, I could tell he didn't believe his own arguments. He was fulfilling his professional obligation to defend his client, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Judge Morrison listened to both opening statements with an impassive expression, taking occasional notes. When Harrison sat down, she looked directly at my mother with an intensity that suggested she'd already formed preliminary opinions. "Mr. Cole, call your first witness," Judge Morrison said. Adrian called Vincent Harper to the stand first. Vincent was sworn in and took his seat with the calm demeanor of someone who knew he was telling the truth and had nothing to hide. Adrian walked him through his friendship with my father, their college years together, the significance of the matching phoenix tattoos. Then he moved to the crucial testimony about my father's final months. "Mr. Harper, were you present when Thomas Brooks updated his will 6 weeks before his death?" Adrian asked. "I was," Vincent confirmed. "Thomas called me specifically to be there as a witness. He wanted someone outside the family present who could testify to his mental state if questions ever arose. He knew Claire might contest his wishes, knew she'd prioritize her own interests over Natalie's welfare, and he wanted protections in place." David Harrison objected. "Speculation about what Mr. Brooks thought or knew." Judge Morrison sustained it but looked unimpressed by the objection. "Mr. Harper, stick to what you observed directly rather than what you believe Mr. Brooks was thinking." Adrian rephrased. "What was Thomas Brooks's demeanor and mental state when you witnessed the will being updated?" Vincent's answer was clear and detailed. Thomas was completely lucid. Tired from the cancer, yes, but mentally sharp. He explained his reasoning for leaving half the estate to Diane Foster for the business and half to Natalie. He talked about wanting to ensure his daughter's financial security, about knowing that Claire had expensive habits and would prioritize her own comfort over Natalie's needs. He was firm, decisive, and absolutely certain about what he wanted. There was no confusion, no hesitation, no indication whatsoever of cognitive impairment. Adrian then played the video of my father explaining his will, recorded on the same day Vincent had witnessed the signing. The courtroom fell silent as my father's image appeared on the screen set up for evidence presentation. He looked gaunt, his face hollowed by illness, but his voice was strong and his eyes were clear. "My name is Thomas Brooks," my father said from beyond death, speaking to this courtroom 5 years after his body had been reduced to ash. "I'm recording this on January 15th to explain my wishes regarding my estate. I'm dying of pancreatic cancer. I know I have weeks left, maybe a month or 2 if I'm lucky. My mind is completely clear. I'm not confused or impaired. I want half my estate to go to Diane Foster to ensure Brooks and Foster architecture continues successfully. I want the other half to go to my daughter Natalie." He paused, and I saw him gathering strength to continue. "Claire, my wife, doesn't understand the value of craft or integrity. She cares about appearances and status. I've watched her prioritize expensive things over meaningful relationships for years. I love her, but I don't trust her to put Natalie's interests ahead of her own desires. Natalie is my legacy in ways that matter. She has my values, my passion for design, my commitment to building things that last. I want her to have the financial security to pursue meaningful work, to create the kind of architecture that makes the world better. Claire will be fine financially. She has her own inheritance from her parents, she'll collect my life insurance, and she's already planning a future with Gregory Palmer whether she thinks I know about that or not." The video showed my father looking directly at the camera with absolute clarity. "If Claire contests this will, if she claims I wasn't of sound mind when I made these decisions, she's lying. I'm recording this specifically to prevent that lie from succeeding. Natalie deserves this inheritance. Claire does not. That's my final word on the subject." The video ended and the courtroom remained silent for several long seconds. I glanced at my mother and saw that her face had gone pale, her carefully maintained composure cracking. She hadn't known about this video, clearly. Richard Sutton must not have discovered it during the original probate case, or if he had, he'd chosen not to tell her it existed. Judge Morrison made a note, her expression thoughtful. "That's powerful testimony, Mr. Cole. Continue." Adrian called Dr. Rita Patel next. The forensic document analyst Lisa Park had brought in to examine the medical records my mother had submitted during the original probate case. Dr. Patel was in her 40s, precise in her speech, with the kind of credibility that came from years of expert testimony in complex cases. "Dr. Patel," Adrian began, "have you examined the medical records submitted by Claire Palmer in the original probate case claiming Thomas Brooks was mentally impaired?" "I have," Dr. Patel confirmed. "I've compared them to the actual medical records obtained directly from Providence Portland Medical Center and from Cascade Hospice Services, the 2 facilities that treated Mr. Brooks during his final months." "What did you find?" "The documents submitted by Mrs. Palmer are fabricated," Dr. Patel said bluntly. "They use correct medical terminology and proper formatting, suggesting whoever created them had some healthcare knowledge or access to legitimate record templates. But they contain multiple indicators of fraud. The fonts don't match Providence's actual medical record system. The digital metadata shows they were created months after Mr. Brooks's death, not contemporaneously with his treatment. Most tellingly, they describe symptoms and behaviors that directly contradict the actual medical records." She pulled up side-by-side comparisons on the courtroom screen. The fabricated records claim Mr. Brooks was confused and disoriented, couldn't recognize family members, exhibited signs of dementia. The actual records show he was alert and oriented ×4, meaning he knew who he was, where he was, what date it was, and what was happening around him. His oncologist noted repeatedly that his cognitive function remained excellent despite his physical decline. The hospice nurses documented clear communication and decision-making capacity up until his final day. Dr. Patel looked directly at Judge Morrison. These fabricated records weren't created by accident or medical error. Someone deliberately falsified them to support a false claim about Mr. Brooks's mental capacity. This is document fraud of the clearest kind. David Harrison tried to challenge Dr. Patel on cross-examination, suggesting the discrepancies might be explained by different doctors having different assessment criteria, but she systematically dismantled every argument he made. By the time he gave up and sat down, it was obvious even to my mother's attorney that the medical records were fake. Adrian then called Thomas Brooks's oncologist, Dr. James Chen, who testified about my father's mental clarity throughout his treatment. He described their conversations about treatment options, about end-of-life planning, about my father's careful arrangements to ensure his business and family were protected. Dr. Chen produced his own contemporaneous notes showing a patient who was facing death with clear-eyed pragmatism and sharp intelligence. The hospice nurse who'd cared for my father in his final weeks, a woman named Carol Martinez, testified next. She described a patient who was in significant pain but remained mentally acute, who asked detailed questions about his medications and their effects, who maintained control over his own care decisions until he physically couldn't communicate anymore. "Your Honor," Carol said at one point, unprompted, "I've been a hospice nurse for 18 years. I've cared for hundreds of dying patients." Thomas Brooks was one of the most mentally present people I've ever worked with at end of life. He was organized, thoughtful, and absolutely clear about what he wanted. Anyone claiming he was confused or impaired is either lying or wasn't actually present during his care. David Harrison didn't even attempt to cross-examine her. What could he possibly ask that wouldn't make his client's fraud more obvious? After the lunch recess, Adrian called me to the stand. I'd been dreading this moment for weeks, afraid I'd freeze up or say something wrong, that I'd somehow damage our case despite telling the truth. But when I sat down in the witness box and looked out at the courtroom, I felt surprisingly calm. My father's video testimony had already done most of the work. I just needed to confirm what everyone now understood. Adrian walked me through my father's final weeks, asking me to describe his mental state, our conversations, his planning and organizing. I testified about sitting with him while he reviewed financial documents, about helping him write letters to important people in his life, about the 3 squeezes of my hand moments before he died. I described a man who was facing death with courage and clarity, not someone confused or impaired. Then Adrian asked me about the aftermath. "Tell the court what happened after your father died," he said gently. I took a breath and began describing my mother's rapid remarriage, her sale of the family home, her order that I find my own place within a month. I testified about struggling financially, about losing my job when my father's estate became tied up in litigation, about maxing out my credit card and burning through my savings. About being evicted, about calling my mother begging for help, about her refusal and her suggestion that I look into shelter resources. "Where were you living in December of last year?" Adrian asked. "On the streets," I said clearly. I was homeless. Sleeping in doorways, eating at shelters, trying to survive while my mother lived in comfort in Lake Oswego. "And where was your mother living at that time?" "In a house purchased with money from the estate settlement," I said, looking directly at my mother for the first time since entering the courtroom. Money my father meant for me to have. Money she stole through fraud. My mother looked away, unable to hold my gaze. Gregory Palmer put his hand on her arm in what was probably meant to be a supportive gesture, but it looked more like he was physically holding her in place. David Harrison approached for cross-examination and I could see him struggling with what questions to ask. He settled for trying to suggest that my homelessness was the result of my own poor decisions rather than my mother's fraud, that I'd had opportunities I'd failed to capitalize on, that my situation wasn't really my mother's responsibility. "Miss Brooks," Harrison asked, "you were 26 years old when you became homeless, correct? An adult capable of supporting yourself?" "I was an adult whose inheritance had been stolen," I replied evenly. "An adult who lost her job because my mother's fraud tied up my father's estate and affected his business partner's ability to keep the firm running. An adult who asked her mother for temporary help and was refused. Yes, I was legally an adult. But I was also a daughter whose mother chose fraud and comfort over basic decency." Harrison moved on quickly, realizing that line of questioning was only making my mother look worse. He asked a few more perfunctory questions then gave up, clearly eager to end cross-examination before I said anything more damaging to his client. Adrian's final witness was Kenneth Ramirez, the private investigator. Ken presented the financial evidence methodically, walking the court through the trail of money from Gregory Palmer's business account to Judge Walsh's offshore account. He showed the emails between my mother and Richard Sutton discussing strategy and evidence fabrication. He presented phone records showing dozens of calls between my mother and Judge Walsh in the weeks leading up to the probate hearing, communications that should never have occurred between a party and the judge hearing their case. "This isn't circumstantial evidence, Your Honor," Ken testified. "This is documented conspiracy. We can prove that Claire Palmer, Gregory Palmer, and Richard Sutton worked together to commit fraud. We can prove Judge Walsh was bribed. We can prove the medical records were falsified. Every element of the fraud is documented and provable beyond any reasonable doubt." When Ken stepped down, Judge Morrison called for closing arguments. Adrian's was brief, simply summarizing what the evidence had shown and asking the court to vacate the fraudulent probate decision and restore my father's actual will. David Harrison's was longer but equally unconvincing, a last desperate attempt to suggest that maybe the evidence wasn't as clear as it appeared, maybe there were innocent explanations for what looked like fraud. Judge Morrison listened to both closings with an expression that suggested she'd already made up her mind. When Harrison sat down, she looked at my mother with something approaching contempt. "I'm going to ask you directly, Mrs. Palmer," Judge Morrison said. "Did you submit falsified medical records in the original probate case?" My mother stood, her lawyer placing a hand on her arm as if to steady her. She began, then stopped. She looked at Gregory Palmer, then at her attorney, then at the evidence displayed on screens around the courtroom. The video of my father declaring his sound mind. The forensic analysis of the fake medical records. The bank records showing the bribe. The emails discussing fraud as casually as grocery lists. "I don't have to answer that," she finally said, her voice weak. "Actually you do," Judge Morrison replied coldly. "You're under oath as a party to this proceeding. Answer the question. Did you submit falsified medical records?" My mother's attorney whispered urgently to her. She shook her head, clearly refusing his advice to admit wrongdoing. "I acted on advice of counsel," she said instead. "Richard Sutton assured me the documents were legitimate." Judge Morrison's expression made clear what she thought of that answer. "Mr. Sutton is currently under investigation by the State Bar for his role in this fraud, and you're suggesting you simply trusted him without question? You expect this court to believe you had no knowledge that you were submitting false evidence?" My mother didn't answer, just stared at the table in front of her. "Let me tell you what I believe happened here," Judge Morrison said, her voice hard. "I believe you decided you wanted your husband's entire estate despite his clear wishes to provide for his daughter. I believe you and Gregory Palmer conspired with Richard Sutton to manufacture false evidence. I believe you bribed Judge Walsh to ensure a favorable ruling. I believe you committed systematic fraud, and I believe you've shown no remorse whatsoever for what you've done to your own daughter." The judge looked down at her notes, then back up at my mother. "This motion is granted. The probate decision from 5 years ago is vacated in its entirety. Thomas Brooks's actual will, executed 6 weeks before his death, is hereby recognized as valid and controlling. Natalie Brooks is entitled to half of Thomas Brooks's estate as he intended. Claire Palmer, you are ordered to return all assets received under the fraudulent probate decision, including the house in West Lynne, all financial accounts, and any property purchased with estate funds." Judge Morrison paused, letting that sink in. "Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. The evidence presented today demonstrates clear criminal conduct by multiple parties. You should expect to be indicted, Mrs. Palmer. This hearing is adjourned." She stood and left the bench while my mother remained frozen at the defendant's table, her face completely drained of color. Gregory Palmer stood up quickly, trying to usher her out of the courtroom before reporters could swarm them, but my mother moved slowly as if in shock. As they passed our table, my mother stopped and looked at me. For just a moment, I saw something in her eyes that might have been genuine remorse or might have been self-pity at getting caught. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but Gregory pulled her away before any words came out. I watched them leave and felt nothing except relief that it was over. Adrian put his hand on my shoulder. "We won," he said simply. "Everything your father wanted for you, you're going to get. And your mother is going to prison for what she did." Vincent was grinning, a rare display of open emotion from someone usually so measured. Your father would be so proud of you, Natalie. You stood up for yourself. You demanded justice. You didn't let them destroy you. We left the courthouse together, walking out into cold February sunshine. News cameras caught footage of us on the courthouse steps, which would run on evening broadcasts under headlines about probate fraud and judicial corruption. Inside my chest, something that had been clenched tight for 5 years, since the day my father died and my mother had looked at me with calculating eyes, finally relaxed. Justice had been served. My father's wishes would be honored. And the woman who'd stolen from me would face consequences that no amount of money or manipulation could prevent. The criminal indictments came 6 weeks after Judge Morrison's ruling. My mother, Gregory Palmer, and Richard Sutton were each charged with multiple felonies including fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and perjury. Judge Harrison Walsh was indicted in absentia, though his extradition from Costa Rica remained uncertain. The district attorney held a press conference describing it as one of the most egregious cases of probate fraud the county had ever prosecuted. My mother's attorney negotiated a plea deal rather than risk trial. She would serve 4 years in prison, pay full restitution including interest, and forfeit all assets obtained through fraud. Gregory Palmer received 3 years. Richard Sutton lost his law license permanently and received 5 years. The sentences felt appropriate, not vengeful but proportionate to the harm they'd caused. The day my mother was sentenced, I sat in the courtroom gallery watching her stand before a different judge to hear her fate. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her choices. Before imposing sentence, the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I stood and walked to the podium, looking at my mother directly for the first time since the fraud hearing. You stole my inheritance, I said, my voice steady. But what you really stole was 5 years of security and peace. You watched me struggle and suffer while living comfortably on money meant to protect me. You committed crimes to avoid sharing what my father wanted me to have. I was homeless on Christmas Eve because of choices you made. The judge paused, and I continued. But you failed. I survived despite you. I rebuilt my life despite you. And I've learned that family is about who shows up when it matters, not about who shares your blood. Vincent and Hannah Harper showed up. My father showed up even after death. You didn't. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. My mother kept her eyes down the entire time I spoke. When the judge pronounced her sentence and the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, she didn't look back. I felt no satisfaction in her punishment, just a quiet sense that justice had been properly served. The estate settlement took another 3 months to finalize. When Adrian called to tell me the money had been transferred to my account, I sat staring at the number on my laptop screen for several minutes. $1.4 million, the inheritance my father had meant for me to have, finally mine after 5 years of fraud and litigation. It should have felt triumphant, but mostly it just felt sad. My father was still dead. The money couldn't bring him back or restore the years I'd lost. But it could honor what he'd wanted for me. I started by paying Adrian's legal fees in full, though he'd offered to reduce them significantly. He'd fought for me when I had nothing, and he deserved to be compensated fairly. I paid Vincent and Hannah back for every expense they'd incurred housing me, despite their protests that they'd never expected repayment. I donated a substantial amount to Cedar Haven Community Shelter in Monica Reeves's name, funding that would help dozens of homeless people receive the kind of support she'd offered me. Then I did what my father would have wanted. I invested most of the money conservatively, creating financial security that would let me choose meaningful work over simply chasing paychecks. I used part of it to start a small foundation providing emergency grants to young adults who'd lost parental support, people in situations similar to where I'd been. The foundation's first recipient was a 24-year-old woman who'd been kicked out by her family and was sleeping in her car. The look on her face when we handed her a check for first month's rent and security deposit reminded me of how I'd felt when Vincent had bought me dinner that first night. Diane Foster offered me a position at Brooks and Foster Architecture, and I accepted. My father's name was still on the building, and working there felt like continuing his legacy in ways that mattered. I designed community centers and affordable housing projects, buildings meant to serve people who needed shelter and stability, architecture that prioritized human dignity over profit margins. Vincent and I remained close, meeting for coffee every few weeks to talk about my father and about how our lives had changed since that Christmas Eve when he pulled up to a bus stop and changed everything. The phoenix tattoo on his arm became a symbol I understood more deeply now. We'd both risen from difficult circumstances. My father had risen from his childhood trauma. I'd risen from homelessness and fraud. The capacity for rebirth was real if you had people who believed you deserved it. 2 years after the criminal trial ended, I received a letter from my mother's prison. She'd written asking to see me, saying she wanted to apologize in person, that she'd had time to reflect on what she'd done. I read the letter once, then put it in a drawer unanswered. Some apologies come too late. Some bridges burn so completely that no amount of regret can rebuild them. She'd made her choices. I'd made mine. We'd both have to live with the consequences. On the 5th anniversary of finding me homeless, Vincent and Hannah invited me to their house for dinner. We sat around the same table where we'd shared that first meal, and Vincent raised his glass in a toast. To Thomas Brooks, he said, who taught us that family is about showing up. And to Natalie, who survived everything thrown at her and built something meaningful from the wreckage. I raised my own glass, looking at these people who'd chosen to love me when they didn't have to, who'd fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. To chosen family, I said. The only kind that really matters. Outside the windows, the lake reflected the late December sunset, and somewhere in the city a young person was probably struggling the way I had, wondering if anyone would ever show up for them. My foundation would keep working to find them. My father's legacy would keep protecting people who needed it. And I would keep rising, keep rebuilding, keep proving that the worst thing that happens to you doesn't have to define who you become. The phoenix had died in flames and been reborn. So had I. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.